Hey guys, tonight we're taking a soothing, slightly horrifying stroll through the strangest, most questionable corner of medical history. The era when medieval Europeans ate human body parts as medicine. Yes, you heard that right. Before you get comfortable, just know this video contains more awkward, chewing, old-timey superstition and questionable ethical decisions than your last 3 family Thanksgivings combined. But first, if you enjoy falling asleep to the gentle sounds of bizarre history and questionable life choices, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim those lights, switch on your fan for that low-budget wind ambiance, and get comfortable. Maybe wrap yourself up like a medieval mummy, just without the side effects. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered who looked at a skeleton in a monastery and thought, that looks nutritious? Or who was the first person to say, I've got a headache? Hand me the powdered pharaoh? Would your co-workers survive a day as a medieval apothecary? Or would they faint at the sight of a literal skull smoothie? And how did anyone survive childhood in a world where the pharmacy was just one poorly guarded graveyard away? Congratulations, you've just woken up in 1553, centuries before penicillin, centuries before ethical review boards, and centuries before anyone asked, hey, is that legal? Good luck. You're in a medieval apothecary, surrounded by glass jars, suspicious powders, and a smell that's somewhere between damp crypt and beef jerky. The doctor pulls out his secret weapon, a bit of mummy powder, ground from Egyptian corpses and imported at great expense. Apparently, there's nothing like ancient royalty for treating your migraines, especially if you can't afford actual medicine or common sense. Let's set the scene a little more. Shelves are crammed with bottles that once held something innocent, maybe olive oil, maybe a little wine. But now, every label reads like a threat. Powder of man's skull, oil of fat, heart tonic, guaranteed genuine. There's a jar of dried moss scraped off the head of an executed criminal, right next to a vial labeled simply essence of toe. You get the feeling that, in this shop, expiration dates are more of a philosophical debate than a safety concern. The apothecary himself is equal parts scientist, grave robber, and used car salesman. He gestures at the mummy powder with a knowing smile, telling you it's tried and true, prescribed by the pharaohs themselves. Never mind that the last pharaoh died 1,000 years ago, or that the medical advice of a civilization that wrapped people like burritos for eternity maybe shouldn't be your go-to. But in a time when you're more likely to die from your doctor than your disease, you take what you can get. This is medical cannibalism in action. The belief that consuming bits and pieces of the dead, preferably someone rich, royal, or recently hanged, could heal the sick, ward off pain, or just add a little excitement to your next fever dream. And if you're wondering who thought this was a good idea, you're not alone. Even in the Middle Ages, people sometimes raised an eyebrow and asked, are you sure about this? But like most questionable trends, all it took was one king with a headache and a persuasive apothecary, and suddenly everyone was elbow deep in powdered ancestor. The logic, if you can call it that, goes something like this. If a body part still has some vital spirit left, especially from someone young, strong, or important, then eating it should transfer those good vibes right into your own failing flesh. It's sort of like believing that drinking Michael Jordan's Gatorade would instantly improve your jump shot, except with more bones and a slightly higher chance of being haunted forever. And nothing, said luxury medicine kite-like Egyptian mummy, imported in crumbling crates, auctioned in markets, and sold at prices that would make modern insurance companies blush. Mummy powder became the medieval superfood of choice. Doctors prescribed it for everything from nosebleeds to epilepsy, and patients chewed it down with a mixture of horror, hope, and a generous glass of wine. Because if you're eating ground-up farro, you probably want something to wash it down. It didn't stop at mummies, of course. Medieval pharmacies sourced ingredients from battlefields, gallows, and tombs. Anywhere you could find a body with a little oomph left in it. Fresh blood from an executed criminal was prized as a tonic for youth and vitality. Need something for those pesky seizures? Try skull moss, harvested with all the ceremony of a midnight crime. And if you're a bit arthritic, why not pick up a jar of human fat, rendered down with spices? It's basically medieval icy hot, just with more existential questions. As you scan the shelves, you can't help but notice how the other customers pretend not to see each other. There's a noble woman eyeing a bottle of elixir of heart, a monk negotiating over the price of thigh bone shavings, and in the corner, a pale man sniffling, clutching a small bag of ground saint dust, which, in this economy, could be anything from holy relic to last Tuesday's leftovers. Everyone is just trying to get better, or at least get ahead of the next round of plague. You buy your mummy powder. You nod politely to the guy buying candied ears, and you try not to make eye contact with anyone. The door creaks behind you as you step back into the world, prescription in hand, and a little piece of ancient royalty now rattling in your pocket. Does it work? Maybe. Probably not. But in a time when hope is as scarce as a good meal, you'll try anything, even if it means becoming your own worst medicine. It all starts innocently enough. A sick king, a desperate physician, and the realization that dried bones are cheaper than leeches. In an era with no germ theory but a lot of free-range corpses, anything that didn't kill you instantly was worth a try. By the time a respected surgeon suggests distilled skull, no one even blinks. The strange thing is, medieval logic wasn't totally illogical, at least not by the standards of the time. There were no microscopes, no double-blind studies, and no FDA recall notices for may contain haunted bone fragments. Most people didn't even know what a cell was, unless it was the cold, damp kind you slept in after losing a bet with the local lord. Instead, medicine was built on a delicate combination of ancient texts, hearsay, and a kind of hopeful, culinary creativity. If something vaguely worked for someone, somewhere, it was good enough to make the rounds in every apothecary and noble court in Europe. Picture yourself as a medieval doctor. You've read Galen, Hippocrates, and Pliny the Elder. People who sounded convincing but also thought sneezing was a sign of good fortune and that onions could cure baldness. Your patients expect miracles, and your treatments are limited to whatever you can boil, crush, or scrape off the nearest skeleton. You're constantly being asked to explain why someone is coughing up frogs, or why the queen's eye twitches whenever she looks at the color purple. There's a certain pressure to innovate, so when someone suggests that the spirit of a dead person might still be lingering in their bones, and that consuming those bones could transfer the dead person's strength, wisdom, or just basic survival skills, it sounds downright modern. If by modern you mean mystical multivitamin meets very questionable ethics. This logic was everywhere. People thought you could fix a weak heart with a bit of dried heart, that epilepsy could be stopped with a whiff of burnt skull, and that powdered mummy was basically Tylenol with more sand. Here's where things get even stranger. Most of these remedies were actually passed down by educated people. University-trained doctors, guys with the medieval version of a PhD, which mostly involved reading books by people who'd never seen a real skeleton, were the main pushers of body part medicine. Some even kept a little starter kit on their desk. A vial of human fat for chest pain, a pinch of blood for anemia, and a decorative skull because nothing says trust me. I'm a professional like a souvenir from the gallows. And it wasn't just the rich or the desperate. Across medieval society, everyone from kings to peasants embraced the logic of like cures like. It's called sympathetic magic, the belief that consuming a healthy part of someone else will fix the same part of you. Got a headache? Try distilled skull. Arthritic? A bit of rendered fat. Kidney trouble? Don't ask. It's the original you are what you eat, but with a strong dose of wishful thinking. Let's not forget the power of public demonstration. At executions, crowds would gather to collect the blood of the newly dead, believing it could cure anything from headaches to falling sickness. Nothing says healthcare for all like a community event centered on someone else's bad life choices. Even priests would get in on the action, offering blessings and occasionally a discreet wink as you carried off your cup of fresh medicine. It was all shockingly normal, as if picking up a prescription at CVS now involved a shovel, a bucket, and a very understanding local constable. But perhaps the most medieval logic of all was this: if it worked once, even by coincidence, then it worked. Period. Did someone's rash clear up after eating powdered finger? That's science. Did a noble's cough disappear right after sipping a tincture of marrow? Publish the recipe. If anyone dared to question the method, there was always a story about a king, a saint, or someone's cousin's neighbor's dog who got better after just a taste of powdered nose. You might wonder, was there ever a moment of doubt? Of course. But in a world where the best alternative was bleeding out into a bowl, chewing on mystery roots, or praying really hard, eating a little corpse dust felt, if not logical, at least possible. The only thing stronger than medieval superstition was medieval optimism, because deep down, everyone hoped that somewhere in that next spoonful of skull, there might be just enough magic, or medicine, to make tomorrow a little bit easier. Forget cough drops. Tonight's special is mummy powder mixed with honey, moss scraped off an executed criminal's skull, and a syrup brewed from bits of bone and human fat. You never know what's in your medicine, but at least it's fresh. If you call just dug up last night fresh, step up to the counter of your neighborhood medieval pharmacy, and you'll be greeted with a dazzling, if slightly nauseating, array of health tonics, powders, and secret recipes. This is where all the most popular cures are on full display. Part pharmacy, part haunted house, part experimental cooking show. On the top shelf, right next to the imported leech jars and dried frog purses, you'll find a neat row of glass bottles labelled Mumia Vera. That's the real deal, authentic, sun-dried, pre-ground Egyptian royalty, supposedly harvested from the tombs of ancient pharaohs, but more often just the nearest local tomb with a good sales pitch. It was the medieval version of name-brand aspirin, if aspirin came with a chance of a curse. How did this trend even get started? Blame a little bit of exotic mystique and a lot of salesmanship. By the late Middle Ages and well into the Renaissance, mummy powder was such a hot commodity that European merchants actually traveled to Egypt to scoop up whatever mummified remains they could find. Human, animal, or we promise it's not just really old jerky. Doctors promised it could cure everything from headaches to stomach cramps to bad dreams, which, considering how stressful eating ground-up farro must have been, was probably useful. But why stop at foreign delicacies? For the truly fresh stuff, you only had to look as far as the local execution grounds. Enter skull moss, technically known as usnea. But that sounds a little too botanical for something scraped off a condemned man's head. Collectors believed that moss, which thrived on the skulls of the recently executed, absorbed some of the victim's remaining vital force. No one asked too many questions about the moss's flavor profile or its texture in tea. It was sprinkled into wine, mixed with honey, or just chewed straight for the full rustic experience. If you suffered from epilepsy or a persistent nosebleed, you were one mug of moss away from medieval relief, or at least a fascinating after-dinner story. And for those who preferred their remedies to go down smoothly, there was always the ever-popular King's syrup. This recipe called for simmering bones and fat, ideally from the noble class, but let's not get picky, with wine, spices, and a little sweetener for taste. Think cough syrup, but with a backstory that could make even the most devoted goth feel squeamish. Sold by the bottle, this elixir promised to soothe coughs, settle nerves, and fortify the blood. Some recipes even claimed an added splash of human marrow gave it extra strength. Because nothing says family medicine like a drink with its own ghost. And it wasn't just the ill or the unlucky. Nobles, clergy, and even royalty swore by these bestsellers. Kings sent their agents to snap up the finest mummy powder before it hit the common market. And doctors competed to score the greenest skull moss for their most prestigious clients. The wealthy might have had better mattresses and less chance of dying from soup. But when it came to the medical menu, everyone was just a spoonful away from medieval madness. The apothecaries, ever the entrepreneurs, leaned into the trend. They offered taste tests, a pinch of mummy on the house, madam, and advertised testimonials from famous customers. Count Geoffrey's lumbago vanished after 3 bottles of our original bone broth tonic. The shelves overflowed with jars promising instant relief, all with the same key ingredients. Something ancient, something recent, something dug up, and something borrowed from last week's public execution. Even kids got in on the act. Parents, desperate to cure childhood fevers or mysterious rashes, would sneak a few drops of syrup or a pinch of mummy into their children's porridge. It was less take your vitamins and more don't ask about the crunchy bits. No one worried about side effects. If anything, the weirder the cure, the better the story for the next village feast. Of course, not all bestsellers were created equal. Some powders were stretched with chalk, some syrups flavored with whatever animal was handy, and many a merchant found themselves accused of watering down their moss with common garden weeds. But in an age with no regulations and lots of enthusiasm, you bought what you could, hoped for the best, and prayed the next epidemic wouldn't make you a bestseller yourself. Getting your hands on authentic, medical-grade human remains wasn't as easy as checking the graveyard lost and found. From bribing the local executioner for the best skulls to paying black market prices for a recently deceased arm, medicine was a team sport with a very shady supply chain. Let's start with the apothecary, a job part pharmacist, part grave robber, and part aspiring entrepreneur with zero respect for boundaries. Your local apothecary was the beating heart of the corpse-based medical economy. Not only did they need to keep a constant supply of body bits on hand, they also had to stay up to date on the latest trends. One year, it was all about fresh blood. The next, everyone wanted moss off the forehead of a hanged man. It was the medieval version of keeping up with superfoods, only with more midnight shoveling and considerably fewer antioxidants. Of course, all this demanded reliable suppliers. Enter the executioner, a man with an axe in one hand and a very profitable side hustle in the other. In most towns, the executioner was both feared and desperately needed, not just for swift justice, but for his access to prime, freshly deceased inventory. Skull with minimal dents? Check. Hands with the right number of fingers? Absolutely. Some executioners even kept waiting lists for the most prized specimens. A virtuous maiden's skull, a recently hanged thief, or anyone whose criminal backstory added a little extra zing to the medicine. Negotiations were anything but subtle. Imagine a doctor sidling up to the gallows after a hanging, quietly slipping the executioner a pouch of coins and muttering, "Save me the head." Yeah? And if the jaw's still attached, I'll throw in an extra florin. No one said the supply chain was dignified. just that it worked. And if the local justice system was running a bit slow, some ambitious apothecaries might encourage a little extra enthusiasm for public executions. After all, business is business, and you can't sell fresh if the supply isn't moving. But the true art of sourcing was reserved for the black market, the midnight market, as it was sometimes called, when official supplies ran dry, or the local church got nosy about the disappearing saints' relics. Things took a turn for the cloak and dagger. Grave robbers, known as resurrection men, would sneak through cemeteries with shovels, lanterns, and nerves of steel, prying open coffins to see if anything looked particularly medicinal. Some even had regular routes, like milkmen with a sideline in femurs. If you ever wondered why medieval towns locked their graveyards at night, now you know. The real monsters weren't ghosts. They were freelance pharmacists with questionable morals and a business to run. There were rules, of course. Sort of. Some apothecaries insisted that certain body parts worked better if they came from sinners, while others claimed you needed the bits of a saint for best results. Others just wanted volume. In the wild world of corpse-based medicine, ethics was more of a sliding scale. If you asked too many questions about where your dried lung came from, you might find yourself getting the customer service smile. The medieval equivalent of, if you don't like it, there's the door. The most exclusive goods, like real Egyptian mummy powder, required even deeper connections. Enterprising merchants traveled across the Mediterranean, bribing tomb raiders, customs officials, and the occasional low-ranking scribe just to get a few dusty pounds of authentic mummy back to Europe. Of course, there was a thriving counterfeit market too. Plenty of mummy in European apothecaries was just ground-up local bodies, painted with bitumen and wrapped in whatever linen was handy. But if you could pass it off as exotic, people would pay double. Just like modern shoppers convinced themselves that imported water tastes better. And then there were the auctions. In some cities, bits of the freshly executed were sold to the highest bidder, right out in the open. Imagine standing in line at a farmer's market. But instead of local honey or hand-knit socks, you're waiting your turn for a ladle of gallows blood or a sliver of gallows bone. No one brought their own shopping bags. You just hoped the apothecary had something clean to wrap your purchase. In some places, families of the executed even sold rights to the corpse, negotiating the final price between grieving and opportunism. By the time the goods reached the shelf, their origin story had usually been laundered as thoroughly as possible. Your medicine might come from the gallows, the grave, or the dark corners of a Mediterranean port. But by the time it was powdered, bottled, and slapped with a Latin label, it was just another remedy. No one asked, and no one wanted to know. The only question was, did it work? And if not, at least you had a story for the next time someone at dinner complained about the taste of their medicine. Nothing says cutting edge like grinding up a 2,000-year-old pharaoh and putting it in your tea. As demand for mummy powder soared, tombs were looted, markets boomed, and most of Europe convinced themselves the best medicine came with a little sand and mystery mold. Let's take a closer look at the world's weirdest health fad. Imagine you're a noble in 16th century Paris, suffering from a headache you're convinced is the result of a curse, the weather, or possibly the third wheel of cheese you ate last night. Your doctor, wearing his best "trust me, I'm an expert" expression, hands you a tiny, dark bottle labeled Mumia Vera. Inside is a fine brownish powder. The label claims it's ground mummy, imported straight from the tombs of the mighty, sun-baked land of Egypt. Nothing impresses the neighbors like ancient royalty in your breakfast porridge. This was not a niche trend. From the Renaissance through the Enlightenment, mummy powder became the kale smoothie of its day. Everyone wanted some. No one really knew what it was. And almost nobody stopped to ask, should we actually be doing this? The logic was vintage medieval. Egyptians were famous for their advanced civilization. So their preserved bodies must contain powerful healing magic. Why trust an ordinary bone when you could sprinkle a little Ramses II on your toast? Tomb raiding turned into a booming business. What began as the occasional enterprising trader poking around old ruins soon became an organized supply chain of grave robbers, shady middlemen, and European merchants with a suspiciously good sense of smell. Ancient burial sites, already picked over by centuries of looters, became fast food windows for anyone with a shovel and a ship bound for Venice, Marseille, or London. Mummy parts were shipped in barrels, sacks, and even by the boatload, sometimes with official paperwork and sometimes under a pile of more legal spices. Of course, this created a crisis of supply and demand. There are only so many 2,000-year-old corpses to go around. And so, predictably, counterfeiting became rampant. Merchants would take any conveniently dead body, sometimes criminals, sometimes unlucky peasants, sometimes a stray camel, wrap it up in bitumen and linen, dry it out, and sell it to unsuspecting customers as genuine Egyptian. If anyone noticed the flavor was a bit off, or the sand a little more French than Nile, nobody said a word. After all, the placebo effect is a powerful thing, especially if you're eating ancient history for breakfast. Doctors prescribed mummy powder for nearly everything: headaches, epilepsy, stomach pain, broken bones, even the plague. The recipe was simple. Scrape a bit of powder into your wine, beer, or honey, mix thoroughly, and swallow without thinking too hard. The recommended dose? Enough to do the job, but not enough to summon a curse. If your symptoms didn't improve, you were told to try a stronger vintage, perhaps from a royal tomb, or, for extra healing, a mummy with a particularly dramatic backstory. Kings, queens, and city doctors all bought in. Apothecaries put up hand-painted signs advertising the finest Egyptian medicine and offered deluxe blends with extra resin, a little more dust, or a suspicious amount of glitter. Some doctors even insisted on applying mummy powder directly to wounds, creating a healing salve that looked and smelled like history's least appetizing protein bar. For a while, Europe became obsessed with all things mummy. Artists ground up mummy to make mummy brown pigment for their paintings. Aristocrats hosted tasting parties, daring each other to guess which dynasty they'd just swallowed. Writers and poets dropped references to mummy powder as the ultimate cure or the ultimate status symbol, depending on how much they liked the host. If social media had existed, there would have been an entire influencer class dedicated to unboxing the latest artisanal mumia shipment. Was any of this effective? Not unless your problem was a lack of ancient microbes or an urge to tell a really good dinner story. At best, you got a mouthful of calcium and a bit of psychosomatic relief. At worst, you got a sudden introduction to the concept of lead poisoning, fungal infections, or whatever interesting bacteria had been thriving in the tomb for a couple of millennia. Still, no one could resist. The myth of Egyptian medicine was stronger than skepticism, and the thrill of consuming a king, no matter how dusty, was too delicious for the European elite to pass up. Eventually, the trend faded, thanks to real science and the small problem of running out of available mummies. But for centuries, mummy powder was Europe's most glamorous medicine. Expensive, mysterious, possibly haunted, and guaranteed to leave you with a taste for adventure, or at least a dry mouth. The local executioner wasn't just the town's party planner. He was also your pharmacist. Freshly executed criminals supplied all sorts of medicinal parts, especially skulls. If you ever wondered what happened to the heads after the crowd went home, let's just say nothing went to waste. Let's talk about job descriptions for a second. In the Middle Ages, executioners had one of the most peculiar resumes in town. Not only did they dispense justice, but they also filled a crucial gap in the supply chain for the local apothecary. It's one thing to be the guy who swings the axe. It's another thing entirely to be the one who supplies tomorrow's headache powder and next week's arthritis ointment. And if you thought the job came with a bad reputation, just imagine explaining at the village feast that you make extra money selling heads by the pound. The logic behind this ghoulish commerce was simple. People believed that the body of a freshly executed criminal was packed with residual vital force. After all, who had more potent energy than someone whose life had just ended in a burst of drama and public spectacle? That's right, your health supplement is freshly decapitated and locally sourced. Take that, farm to table. Execution Day was a community event. As the condemned took their final walk, you could spot apothecaries, healers, and even desperate townsfolk crowding close to the scaffold, not just for the spectacle, but for first dibs. The freshest heads and warmest blood fetched the best price, especially if the crime was particularly juicy. Was the criminal a highwayman? That might be just the thing for a restorative tonic. Was he a traitor? Even better, everyone loves a little political flavor in their morning remedy. After the axe fell and the crowds dispersed, the real business began. The executioner and his assistants got to work, removing skulls, collecting blood, and sometimes, if there was a special order, taking hands, fat, or other parts needed for the latest trending cure. Many executioners had standing agreements with local apothecaries, arranging midnight exchanges of goods for coin, favors, or the occasional off-the-books favor. In some towns, there were even waiting lists. Got an uncle with epilepsy? The next green skull could be yours, for the right price and a wink from the hangman. Every bit of the executed body found a use. The skull, once cleaned, was dried and powdered, believed to be particularly effective for seizures and migraines. The blood, still warm, was thought to be a powerful tonic if consumed immediately. Some sufferers of epilepsy would wait anxiously at the base of the scaffold, goblet in hand, hoping for a miraculous cure with the last drops. Human fat was rendered for use in balms, believed to heal bruises, sprains, or even broken bones. Even the moss that grew on exposed skulls found a buyer, prized as skull moss, and claimed to cure everything from nosebleeds to the plague. It was the original zero-waste movement, if you can call it that. The apothecary's shop became a kind of extension of the execution ground. Bottles labelled cranium powder or genuine gallows fat lined the shelves. Customers rarely asked about sourcing. They were more concerned with freshness and, perhaps, the notoriety of the original owner. Nothing says I'm serious about my health like a little ground-up outlaw in your wine. But let's not romanticize it. There was nothing glamorous about being an executioner, and even less about being the raw materials for medieval healthcare. The stigma of the job was real. Executioners and their families were often shunned, forced to live on the outskirts of town, or forbidden from marrying into respectable families. The money was good, but the dinner invitations were few and far between. Of course, the trade wasn't exactly above board. Black markets thrived, especially when demand for certain cures outstripped supply. Stories spread of executioners sneaking out of town with extra heads tucked under their cloaks, making lucrative side trips to nearby villages eager for a fresh shipment. As gruesome as it was, everyone turned a blind eye as long as the medicine cabinet stayed stocked. Eventually, as medical science crept forward, and as people realized there were only so many criminals to go around, the use of executioner-supplied remedies began to wane. But for centuries, every healing cup, every headache powder, and every miracle ointment was a grim reminder. In medieval Europe, health and justice shared more than just a scaffold. So next time you reach for an aspirin, remember, at least it didn't start its journey at the gallows. Tired? Anemic? Time for a nice warm glass of medicinal blood, preferably from someone recently departed. And ideally, while it was still warm, doctors swore it could cure anything from headaches to heart palpitations. The only catch was, you had to drink it fast, before the executioner's assistant finished cleaning up. Let's be honest, even the boldest modern juice bar would struggle to make blood, now with extra iron catch on, as a wellness trend. But in the world of medieval medicine, drinking blood, especially from a freshly executed criminal, was the ultimate energy shot. Forget acai berries or wheatgrass. If you wanted to be at your healthiest, you queued up at the gallows with a cup in hand and hope in your heart, and hopefully not too much squeamishness. The belief behind this was surprisingly logical. If your logic comes with a heavy side of superstition and a total lack of germ theory, blood was considered the very essence of life, pulsing with whatever mysterious force animated bodies and made people walk, talk, and complain about taxes. If you were sick, it only made sense to top up your own supply with a little extra vitality from someone who, moments before, had plenty to spare. And who had more vitality than someone who had just been, well, removed from circulation? Epilepsy was one of the main ailments treated this way. Families would send loved ones to public executions with strict instructions. Get to the front of the crowd, grab a cup, and don't be shy about shoving. The closer you were to the scaffold, the better your chances of getting blood that was still warm, fresh, and presumably packed with magical healing energy. Nothing quite like pushing past your neighbors to get the last drop before the executioner rinsed the platform. Doctors swore by it. Some insisted the blood had to be gulped straight from the wound, while others advocated for fortifying it with a bit of wine, honey, or even a pinch of mummy powder, just to keep things lively. If you were feeling especially refined, you might sip your crimson tonic from a silver goblet. If not, a piece of bread dipped right into the pooling blood would do. It was a recipe passed down through the generations, and nobody questioned the prue's aftertaste. Of course, the social side effects were considerable. Imagine being the person in town known for never missing an execution, always lurking with a travel mug and a hopeful glint in your eye. Executioners became minor celebrities among the chronically ill, sometimes even taking bribes to favor one family over another. A lucky patient might even get a pre-release sample before the crowd arrived. Call it the medieval version of early access. It wasn't just the poor or desperate who sought out blood tonics. Nobles and well-to-do citizens also bought in, sending their servants to collect a fresh vial after a high-profile hanging or beheading. Blood was sometimes mixed into syrups or even congealed into a jelly for later use. The truly committed stored it in tightly sealed bottles, never mind that the concept of refrigeration was a few centuries away, and shelf life was measured in hours. Of course, not every superfood smoothie was created equal. Some patients insisted on blood from sinless victims, children or virgins, believing purity enhanced the cure. Others claimed a notorious criminal's blood, charged with a lifetime of wrongdoing, packed an extra medicinal punch. As with most things in medieval medicine, personal preference and urban legend mattered just as much as scientific reasoning, maybe more. The business side was just as complex. Executioners, ever the opportunists, developed a side trade in blood and other products of justice. Some even carried special cups or ladles for the purpose, making sure not a single drop went to waste. There were stories of enterprising townsfolk bottling blood to sell later at the market, though no one ever mentioned how well that actually worked. If you missed the main event, you could still grab a bottle at your local apothecary. Marked up, of course, for added convenience. Did it work? Unsurprisingly, no. Most patients got little more than a strong placebo effect and a memorable story. Some probably picked up a bonus infection, while others simply got queasy and reconsidered their life choices. But in an age where medicine was part magic, part hope, and mostly let's try anything once, blood retained its spot as the original superfood, straight from the source. If you've ever looked at a mossy gravestone and thought, I bet that's medicinal, you might have a future as a medieval doctor. Moss scraped off the skulls of the hanged was considered a magical cure for nosebleeds, epilepsy, and even fits of hysteria. Smells like progress. Welcome to the wild world of medieval pharmaceuticals, where anything growing in the wrong place or on the wrong person was instantly up for medical debate. Skull moss, or Usnea cranii, was not just any old greenery. It was the star ingredient in some of the era's most prized remedies. The logic was part folklore, part urban legend, and all in on magical thinking. If a patch of moss could survive and thrive on a human skull, surely it absorbed some of that person's spirit, memories, or lingering, let's call it, energetic residue. And if that person happened to be an executed criminal, all the better. Bonus vitality, extra drama, and a story to impress your next dinner guests. Let's paint the scene. The morning after an execution, the local apothecary, or, if we're being honest, anyone handy with a chisel and a total lack of squeamishness, would creep through the dew-damp graveyard, armed with a small knife and an empty jar. They'd carefully scrape off the moss from the most recent batch of skulls. The fresher the better, but sometimes you just had to take what you could get. You didn't want moss from any old skull, mind you. Preferably, it had to be a criminal, someone who died violently, preferably unjustly. So the moss was rich with what medieval doctors called condensed life force. This made it extra potent, at least according to the kind of logic that thrives when there's no internet to fact-check you. What did people actually do with this moss? If you suffered from seizures, also called the falling sickness, you'd be prescribed a little dried moss, either rolled into a pill, steeped into a pungent tea, or sprinkled over your porridge for a bit of medicinal crunch. If your nose was bleeding, a pinch of moss up the nostril was the recommended solution. If your wife's nerves were delicate, or your neighbour's child had the screaming fits, a quick dash of skull moss was sure to do the trick, at least until everyone lost interest and moved on to the next ailment. Apothecaries were only too happy to play up the mystique. Jars of moss of the hanged were displayed right up front, next to the snake oil and genuine mummy powder. Some shops even had little wooden signs that read, "Fresh from the gallows, cures guaranteed, ghosts extra." If you think supplement marketing is wild now, imagine trying to convince your neighbour that their nosebleed is best treated with a botanical garnish from last Thursday's Highwayman. The preparation was a ceremony all its own. After gathering, the moss had to be dried gently. Too much sun, and the life force would escape. Too little, and you'd get mold instead of medicine. It was usually ground into powder, mixed with honey, wine, or vinegar for added potency, and carefully measured by someone who had only the vaguest idea of what dose meant. And like most medieval remedies, the recipe changed from village to village, and apothecary to apothecary. If you asked 3 different practitioners how to use skull moss, you'd get 5 different answers, none of which sounded particularly appetizing. Side effects? Oh, there were plenty, mostly disappointment, followed by the possible urge to question all of your life choices. Some claimed the moss brought strange dreams, or even the faint whisper of the criminal's final words. Others insisted it simply tasted awful and didn't help at all. But since placebo was the most reliable medicine in the Middle Ages, everyone pretended it worked if it meant fewer seizures and a little more peace and quiet at home. Still, the belief in skull moss was stubborn. Physicians with university degrees recommended it. Noble families paid top coin for it. And even skeptics sometimes gave in, after all. What else was there to try? It was a world where magic and medicine danced arm in arm, and the most unexpected things could end up in your bowl. The medieval solution for joint pain wasn't just another leech, no. It was human fat, candied with sugar and spices, and eaten like a dessert. Move over, gummy vitamins. It's time for a treat that's both deeply unsettling and weirdly festive. So, you wake up with stiff knees and knuckles that sound like a gravel road when you stand. You limp into the local apothecary, clutching your aching joints, and instead of being offered a warm bath or gentle exercise, you're handed a small, delicately wrapped sweet. The secret ingredient? Rendered human fat, delicately simmered with honey, cinnamon, maybe a touch of clove, because, as everyone knows, a little holiday spice makes anything go down easier, especially someone's ex-thief uncle. Let's talk about how you end up with a medieval bonbon like this. Apothecaries and barber surgeons worked hard to keep a steady supply of medicinal fat on hand. The best came from the recently executed, preferably young, healthy, and, for some reason, the more notorious the better. The executioner, always eager to supplement his income, set aside the choicest bits, while enterprising apothecaries lined up with their coin purses and recipes. After all, what could be more logical than using someone's well-marbled thighs to treat your grandmother's arthritis? Once collected, the fat was rendered, melted down and carefully strained until it reached the right consistency. Then it was mixed with sugar, which was expensive and hard to come by, making this treatment an elite luxury. A splash of rose water, a sprinkle of nutmeg, and voila, you had a confection that wouldn't look out of place in the court of a king, at least until you read the ingredient list. How was it used? Some people ate it as is, relishing the sweet, greasy sensation, and hoping their joints would loosen before their conscience caught up. Others spread it on bread, disguised it in pies, or stirred it into their morning porridge. Anything to avoid the full horror of what they were actually consuming. Children with aching limbs or mysterious pains got smaller doses, lovingly fed by parents who swore by its power, and probably spent their afternoons wondering why grandma's cookies tasted so meaty. For more localized pain, candied human fat could be melted into a balm and rubbed directly onto the skin. This approach, while less likely to induce existential dread at the dinner table, came with its own risks. Mainly, the fact that rubbing someone else's fat onto your body, no matter how sweetly scented, didn't guarantee anything except a sticky shirt and the suspicion of your neighbors. It's easy to laugh at this now, but for medieval folks, candied fat was a real luxury, part medicine, part status symbol, and part culinary dare. Apothecaries showed off their jars of golden, glistening treatment with pride, promising it would chase away aches, banish swelling, and put the bounce back in your step. No one seemed bothered by the supply chain, which involved a fair bit of grave robbing, black market bartering, and a robust denial of exactly whose fat was in each batch. Ignorance was, as always, medicinal. Socially, the fat treat was sometimes shared during family meals or at church festivals, adding a festive, if macabre, note to the proceedings. If you ever want to appreciate how far food labeling has come, imagine the medieval village potluck. Try the gingerbread. Avoid the mystery jam. And, oh, that marzipan. It's special for Auntie's joints. If you think this was all fringe quackery, think again. Physicians and clergy wrote prescriptions for candied fat. Nobles requested it by name, and it appeared in the household ledgers of respectable families. In a world without ibuprofen or Tylenol, any promise of relief, no matter how unsettling, was worth the price. Even the church only half-heartedly disapproved. After all, the ingredients were blessed by necessity, if not by choice. Did it work? Not really, unless you count distraction by shock as a form of pain relief. Placebo effect aside, the most powerful ingredient was probably sugar, which made even the most unpalatable cure taste, well, slightly better than the local beer. And if your arthritis didn't improve, at least you had a story for the next family gathering. Remember the time you ate that lovely toffee and your knee stopped hurting for a week? Or was it just the horror that made you forget your pain? With demand for fresh corpses at an all-time high, the medical industry spawned a new profession, the resurrection man. Part grave robber, part logistics specialist, he could deliver a corpse faster than Amazon Prime. Whether you needed a bit of heart or just a handful of bones, there was a price for everything. Let's set the scene. Midnight, damp fog curling around crooked headstones, and somewhere in the darkness, two men in patched cloaks quietly lift a shovel. No, they're not visiting Grandma. They're here on business. And business, if you're in the corpse trade, is booming. Thanks to the medical world's appetite for fresh ingredients, the graveyard was less a final resting place and more a kind of after-hours farmer's market. The resurrection man, or resurrector, if you want to be polite, was an essential link in the medieval supply chain for human-based remedies. Hospitals, universities, and apothecaries needed a steady stream of specimens for everything from anatomical study to the next big batch of headache powder. And while it's easy to picture these body snatchers as mustache-twirling villains, most were just trying to make a living in a world where the classified section did not include remote work from home or be your own boss. The job called for discretion, steady nerves, and a total disregard for the possibility of being cursed by angry ghosts. Competition was fierce. The best resurrection men ran tight, well-oiled operations. They knew the burial schedules, bribed the local sexton, and could pop a coffin open with the speed of a modern-day locksmith. Some even had apprentices, who presumably started out with small jobs like carry the lantern or distract the mourners, and worked their way up to main shovel. Timing was everything. Wait too long, and the corpse was no longer medicinal grade. Arrive too soon, and you might bump into a relative, another crew of body snatchers, or the world's most judgmental priest. And it wasn't just about speed. The resurrection man had to be a master of logistics. Some doctors wanted a whole body, perfect for research, a rare treat. Others just wanted a particular organ, a few bones, or a nice patch of skin for an ointment. Customers got picky. No, sorry, I ordered a left hand, not a right. And do you have anything in a slightly younger age bracket? There were even special requests for criminals only, as if virtue spoiled the flavour. The job was dangerous too. Graveyards in busy towns were patrolled, and punishment for getting caught could range from a hefty fine to a permanent ban from the best pubs in town. The true medieval nightmare. Rival body snatchers were territorial. More than one shovel duel broke out under the moonlight, each side fighting for exclusive rights to the freshest plots. But the rewards, for those with the stomach, were substantial. Resurrection men were paid in hard cash, with bonuses for the freshest finds and rare body parts. Some even set up standing orders with local apothecaries. 2 femurs and a jawbone, every Friday, rain or shine. Delivery was, of course, strictly after dark. No one wanted to see where their medicine came from, just that it was effective, preferably with a little backstory to impress their friends. Not surprisingly, the trade developed its own secret language. If you overheard someone in the market mutter about picking up a midnight parcel, you knew not to ask follow-up questions. The best body snatchers knew how to blend in, slip through alleys, and look perfectly innocent while carrying a suspiciously large sack that sometimes wriggled a little more than you'd like. The community, meanwhile, had mixed feelings. On the one hand, everyone was horrified by the idea of Grandma's grave being disturbed. On the other, when illness struck, Even the most pious villagers found themselves quietly thankful for a steady supply of remedies. As long as it was someone else's ancestor on the chopping block, people could live with a little grave robbing in the name of health. Eventually, authorities cracked down on the trade. But as long as corpse medicine was in fashion, resurrection men were as vital to medieval healthcare as the apothecary or the doctor, if a lot less socially acceptable. In the end, every bottle on the shelf had a story, and every remedy came with a price, paid in coin, conscience, or both. If you thought snake oil was bad, wait until you meet King's Drops, a royal-approved elixir made from human skulls, gold leaf, and the occasional pinch of actual corpse. Fit for a king, guaranteed to taste like bad decisions. The thing about medieval medicine is that it wasn't just the peasants raiding graveyards and brewing up questionable potions. Royalty, always on the lookout for the next miracle cure, led the charge in making corpse-based remedies a trend. If the king was swallowing a goblet of liquefied skull before breakfast, who was the average villager to argue? The logic was simple. If it's good enough for a king, it's good enough for you, no matter how revolting the ingredient list. After all, nothing says divine right quite like sipping on something that could double as haunted soup. King's Drops, sometimes called Aqua Reginae or Royal Elixir, was the designer drug of its day. Apothecaries made it to order, boiling down powdered skull, usually from the most recently executed or blessed individual they could find, with rare spices, shimmering gold leaf, and occasionally a dash of mummy. The resulting liquid was believed to treat everything from migraines to melancholy, purify the blood, and imbue the drinker with a little extra gravitas. At the very least, it gave you something to talk about at the next royal feast. Yes, Your Highness, my complexion is simply glowing after that last bottle of skull syrup. This royal stamp of approval did wonders for sales. Suddenly, nobles and merchants were tripping over themselves to order a vial or two of King's Drops, hoping for a little royal luck or maybe just a more fashionable death. Apothecaries advertised their connections to the crown, sometimes forging a letter or two to prove their wares had palace approval. You could barely throw a turkey leg at a feast without hitting someone bragging about their personal supply of the king's elixir. Just don't ask too many questions about the sourcing, especially if the local graveyard had recently been reseeded. For doctors, a royal patient was the ultimate testimonial. Kings and queens, desperate for relief from headaches, indigestion, or whatever mysterious ailment came from wearing 10 pounds of velvet in July, became walking advertisements for corpse cures. If a king survived the winter thanks to a daily dose of liquefied skull, you could bet that everyone from the court jester to the village scribe would be lining up for a taste. And if a king didn't survive, well, it's not like the medicine ever got the blame. The taste? Unforgettable, and not in a good way. Even the best apothecaries struggled to disguise the flavor, layering in honey, spices, or orange peel to mask the essence of old bone. The brave claimed it was earthy. The less brave simply held their noses and hoped for the best. There were even special silver spoons crafted for the purpose, engraved with royal crests to remind you that, yes, this is definitely medicine, not a prank from the kitchen staff. Of course, royal endorsement didn't mean everyone was convinced. Some critics muttered that corpse oil was nothing but superstition and slick marketing, especially when the king's miraculous recovery coincided with a week of rest and a new mistress. But in a world where status mattered as much as survival, swallowing a little haunted syrup seemed like a small price to pay for staying on the right side of the palace rumour mill. As science progressed, corpse oil finally lost its royal sheen. But for centuries, it remained the gold standard of medieval wellness. So, if you've ever wondered why health trends can get so strange, just remember, if you're following the royal example, be careful what you wish for. especially if it comes in a bottle with a skull and crossbones on the label. Ethics in the Middle Ages was less about patient rights and more about plausible deniability. If no one could prove where the body came from, it was fair game. Monks, priests, and apothecaries all shrugged and agreed. It's not cannibalism if it's medicinal. Let's be honest, there was no official ethics committee in the medieval world, unless you count the group of people who gathered in the tavern to see who could come up with the best excuse for raiding the graveyard last night. Morality was more of a gentle suggestion than a hard rule. And when it came to corpse medicine, even the most devout managed a bit of selective vision. After all, if God didn't want you to eat a little saint's elbow for your migraines, why did he make it so easy to sneak into the crypt? The big question was, how much could you get away with before someone noticed or cared? The church, technically, condemned cannibalism. But the line got fuzzy when you called it medicine. If a monk could chew on a relic and claim it brought him closer to holiness, why couldn't a peasant do the same and call it treatment? Priests wrote lengthy treatises debating whether eating powdered skull was a sin. But as long as the collection plate stayed full and the tithe came in on time, nobody seemed to lose sleep. In fact, some monasteries quietly sold relics to apothecaries, especially when funds were running low or a new roof was needed. For their part, apothecaries were experts in plausible deniability. Sourcing was always anonymous, and nobody put too much effort into asking where the fresh supply came from. If a client asked if the moss on their pill really came from a highwayman's skull, the answer was always, "Of course." Would I lie to you? Spoiler. Yes, absolutely, they would. And if the local priest ever raised an eyebrow, the apothecary could quickly point to a royal decree, a particularly enthusiastic bishop, or just mumble something in Latin until everyone got bored and left. Patients, meanwhile, perfected the art of not asking questions. If the only thing standing between you and a week of agony was a mysterious powder labeled "sourced with piety," you learned not to read the fine print. Maybe it was a relic. Maybe it was some guy named Relic. Either way, it's not cannibalism if the pharmacist winks and blesses the bottle, right? There were, of course, the occasional troublemakers. Some philosophers and a handful of church officials dared to say what everyone else was ignoring. Maybe using other people as a medical buffet wasn't very ethical. Their reward? Long, angry letters, polite shunning, and sometimes a quiet transfer to a remote priory. After all, nobody likes the person who ruins the potluck by asking where the meat came from. Even the courts played along. If someone was caught digging up graves, the punishment depended entirely on their social standing, connections, and how many people at the trial also had a headache they couldn't get rid of. If you were a noble or an official apothecary, a slap on the wrist. If you were a poor grave robber without the right friends, congratulations. You were about to become next week's fresh supply. Medieval society as a whole was built on a kind of don't ask, don't tell when it came to the medical uses of body parts. It was easier to accept the story, buy the potion, and avoid eye contact with anyone who seemed a little too familiar with the graveyard's back gate. At the end of the day, it was all about results. If the cure worked, or at least didn't kill you instantly, people found ways to justify just about anything. Every hanging wasn't just a spectacle. It was an opportunity. Crowds gathered, not just to watch, but to collect fresh blood, hair, or other remedies straight from the source. The best seats were reserved for anyone with a bad case of gout or entrepreneurial spirit. Let's be honest. For most medieval folks, entertainment options were limited. No football, no Netflix, and definitely no Instagram reels. If you wanted a day out, the local execution was as good as it got. But for those in the know, executions weren't just the town's most dramatic live event. they were also your best chance to snag the freshest batch of medicine money or hustle could buy. Welcome to the medieval health fair, where the only thing more valuable than a front row seat was a clean cup and a quick hand. Execution days were practically a community festival. The announcement of a hanging or beheading drew people from miles around, each hoping to claim a piece of the action. The market stalls would be bustling, vendors selling bread and beer to spectators, and children darting around underfoot, blissfully unaware that their parents were really there for the free samples. The mood was rowdy, part justice, part carnival, and part health and wellness expo, with a side of horror. The real action, though, was at the base of the scaffold. While the majority of onlookers were there for the drama, those with a sick relative or a chronic ailment jockeyed for prime position. Apothecaries, midwives, and even enterprising peasants pressed in close, vials and cloths at the ready. The moment the executioner finished his job, it was a mad scramble to collect whatever medicinal bits the criminal's body could provide. Blood was, of course, the hottest commodity, said to cure everything from epilepsy to persistent melancholy. Quick-fingered collectors dipped goblets, mugs, or just a crust of bread into the pooling blood, while others snipped locks of hair or even made deals for teeth and nails. It was the original locally sourced health craze, with the added bonus of being fresh, if not exactly organic. If you suffered from gout, a bad back, or a stubborn rash, you'd be encouraged to rub a cloth, soaked in executioner's blood, on the affected area, or, for the especially daring, to take a sip. Children were sometimes made to taste a drop or two, much to their lifelong psychological regret. And if you couldn't snag blood, don't worry. The criminal's hair, sweat, or even the rope from the hanging was rumoured to have healing powers. There's nothing like a necklace made from recycled justice. The entrepreneurial spirit thrived in this environment. Some resourceful individuals staked out territory in advance, saving spots for friends or family willing to pay a premium. Others acted as middlemen, gathering blood and bits to sell later at the market, or directly to local apothecaries. In a particularly strong flu season, prices soared and bidding wars broke out. If you ever wondered where the phrase cutthroat business comes from, medieval medicine might just be the answer. Naturally, the church and authorities had complicated feelings about this medical free-for-all. On the one hand, they frowned on the chaos and the superstitions, issuing the occasional sermon or public condemnation. On the other, they quietly recognized the social value of giving people hope, and let's be honest, as long as it kept the crowd quiet and the local apothecaries' shelves stocked, nobody was shutting things down. Did these public health fairs actually help? Not in any medical sense, but hope is its own kind of medicine, and the placebo effect was alive and well. For every person who claimed a miraculous cure, 10 more got nothing but a good story and a little extra iron in their diet. Still, the ritual lived on, a blend of spectacle, desperation, and the stubborn belief that if you just got the right seat at the next execution, you might finally find relief. Who needs antibiotics when the king's sweaty palm is available? Belief in the healing power of royal bodies meant kings could cure disease by touch, or at least leave you with a memorable story for your friends at the pub. Let's step back to an age when medicine was more performance art than science, and status was as curative as any herb or tonic. In the medieval world, the king wasn't just the guy with the biggest chair. He was also your nearest overqualified faith healer. If you suffered from the king's evil, a very dramatic term for scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that causes swollen lymph nodes, the best prescription was not a doctor, but a personal meet and greet with His Majesty. The king would lay hands on the afflicted, mutter a blessing, and just like that, you were supposed to be on the mend, assuming you didn't catch something else in the royal crowd. This wasn't some obscure ritual reserved for a chosen few. For centuries, lines of the sick would form outside castles and palaces, each person hoping for their chance at a miraculous cure by touch. Some travelled for days or weeks, sleeping in muddy fields just for a shot at being patted by a monarch in an overcrowded throne room. Today, you might wait 4 hours to see a specialist. In the Middle Ages, you might wait 4 days to be grazed by a king's pinky finger. The disappointment was, unfortunately, not covered by medieval insurance. The royal touch ceremony itself was peak medieval pageantry. Heralds announced the event, priests sprinkled blessings, and guards kept order as crowds pressed in, clutching their sick children and a lifetime's worth of hope. The king, draped in velvet and smelling faintly of soap and nervous sweat, would solemnly place his hands on the afflicted, sometimes giving out a special touch piece, a blessed gold coin to keep as a memento and, theoretically, an ongoing channel to royal healing power. If nothing else, you left with an awesome souvenir and an even better pub story. Of course, there was logic to all of this, at least by medieval standards. Kings were believed to be chosen by God, so it stood to reason that their touch would have a little extra oomph when it came to smiting disease. If you're already wearing a crown, why not cure some boils while you're at it? Royal propaganda loved this narrative. Chronicles overflowed with tales of miraculous healings, and as long as a few people got better, most likely because their illness was self-limiting anyway, word spread that the king was as potent as his throne was comfy. For the monarchy, it was a win-win. If people got better, the king's legend grew. If they didn't, well, it was probably because their faith wasn't strong enough, or they'd sinned too much, or Saturn was in retrograde. The royal court never took the blame, and the endless line of supplicants reinforced the idea that the king wasn't just a ruler, but a walking miracle on 2 legs. It was a medieval PR masterstroke. Naturally, not everyone was a true believer. Some chronic skeptics whispered about faked cures and carefully planted miracle cases. Others grumbled that the king's touch was more likely to leave you with a cold than a cure. But who wants to be the person in the village scoffing at the king's magical hands? Especially when everyone else is showing off their royal blessed coins, like the world's first NFT collection. The practice lasted for centuries, only fading as real medicine and a hint of skepticism started to take hold. Eventually, even the monarchs themselves began to feel a little awkward about the whole sweaty palm healing act, especially when the only thing they were really curing was a crowd's sense of hopelessness. Still, the idea lingered. Maybe not the actual touch, but the desperate hope that somewhere out there, someone powerful could fix what ails you, if only you could get close enough. So the next time you feel tempted to DM a celebrity for life advice, just remember, it's the modern version of the royal touch, minus the velvet robe, and with a lot less chance of catching scrofula. Why wait until adulthood to build your immune system? Medieval pediatric care meant introducing kids to skull elixirs, blood tonics, and the occasional candied toe. Childhood was just as weird as you'd expect. Let's take a gentle step back from the horrors of leech therapy and look at the even stranger world of medieval kids' medicine. Because if you thought growing up back then meant simple story time and a little spoonful of honey for your cough, think again. In the Middle Ages, childhood illnesses weren't met with chicken soup and cuddles. They were met with a smorgasbord of remedies that could double as Halloween dares. It started young. From their very first fever, medieval children were introduced to the wonders of proven remedies, many of which came straight from the local graveyard or gallows. Got a stubborn cold? Or the sniffles? Mom might slip a bit of powdered skull into your broth, just enough to strengthen the head. Persistent cough? There's nothing like a spoonful of blood tonic, warmed, ideally, to clear the lungs and refresh the spirit. Even the most stoic, modern parent would flinch at the idea of passing their kid a vial of what was essentially liquefied highwayman. As with most medieval treatments, the logic was both creative and terrifying. The theory of sympathetic magic suggested that a healthy child could absorb the remaining life force of the recently deceased. If a criminal was executed for being too rowdy, a pinch of his powder might lend a little extra bravery to a timid boy, or calm the wild nerves of a child plagued by nightmares. Why risk regular medicine when you could microdose haunted energy before bedtime? And of course, no one skipped dessert, especially not when it was candied toe. Apothecaries took their cue from the adult world and whipped up sweet treats with a morbid twist. Little chunks of preserved fat or tiny bone fragments, rolled in sugar and wrapped in colourful cloth, like a grim version of Halloween candy. Kids swapped stories about which criminal their medicine came from, and who got the batch from that really famous highwayman last month. Nothing builds playground cred like surviving a dose of candied thumb. Children weren't just passive recipients of these cures. They were a medical experiment in progress. With childhood mortality painfully high, parents and healers threw every possible remedy at the wall, hoping something would stick. If a kid's fever broke after a spoonful of skull syrup, the whole village took note. Next thing you knew, everyone's porridge came with a side of something special, and suddenly parents were trading recipes and graveyard tips at church socials. Doctors and clergy alike got in on the act. No medieval physician wanted to be the one who lost a child because he refused to prescribe a little corpse-based boost. Even priests handed out blessed relic dust for teething babies, whispering a prayer and crossing their fingers that the holy powder would be more effective than whatever Aunt Agnes scraped off her windowsill. Ethics rarely entered the blast of Ray's conversation. If the potion didn't work, well, at least you tried. And there was always next week's batch. The only upside to this horror show was the placebo effect. Many children, terrified into submission by the sheer weirdness of their medicine, probably convinced themselves it worked. After all, if you can swallow a candied toe, you can handle anything a cold can throw at you. And if not, well, there's always tomorrow's public execution for a fresh supply. Every town had its own travelling medicine man, hawking bottles of mystery liquid and jars of powdered hero. Most of these salesmen couldn't spell pharmacy, but that didn't stop them from selling out every night. Imagine a medieval market square, bustling with gossip, squawking chickens, and the unmistakable sound of a bell rung by a man in a hat far too large for his station. Enter the travelling quack, a master of showmanship, part doctor, part magician, and all in on the fine art of creative lying. His wagon creaks into town, every plank promising miracles, every shelf stacked with elixirs, balms, and powders that looked suspiciously like whatever he found in the nearest graveyard or butcher shop the night before. The travelling quack was an entertainer first, a chemist a distant second, and a genuine healer only by accident. He would park his cart right in the middle of the action, throw open the curtains, and begin his pitch. Step right up, cure your aches, banish your fevers, and, for an extra penny, put some pep in your step with my famous elixir of life, guaranteed to contain at least one part recently departed. No ailment was too small, and no ingredient too odd. His crowd was everyone from curious children to desperate grandmothers, all drawn in by the hope of a miracle, or, at the very least, a distraction from reality. He'd wave a bottle of essence of hero, powdered bone mixed with sugar and a sprinkle of mystery, claiming it could make any weakling brave. For those suffering from heartbreak or failing eyesight, there was widow's comfort, a syrup the colour of despair, rumoured to contain a drop of blood from a wronged lover. And for children who couldn't sleep, midnight dust, a sleep aid that probably owed more to poppy seeds than to any secret ingredient. The quack's show was just as important as his wares. He'd light a small fire, perform a sleight of hand, maybe pull a chicken out of a hat, or pretend to heal a child's limp with a dramatic tap on the shoulder. To skeptical townsfolk, he'd offer a free taste, just a pinch of hero for courage, and wait for the inevitable gagging before assuring everyone that the bitterness means it's working. The quack's dog, looking long-suffering and possibly also medicated, circled the cart collecting coins and the occasional uneaten lozenge. Of course, most of what he sold was harmless: sugar, dried herbs, chalk, a dash of wine, and just enough rumour to make it seem magical. But for those willing to pay a premium, he offered the real stuff. A jar of powdered martyr for the truly devout, a little vial labelled gallows spirits, promising to ward off evil dreams, and, for those with truly deep pockets and questionable morals, a candied bone or a slice of blessed fat from someone who died with a full set of teeth. Always a good sign, said the quack. There were risks, of course. Town constables sometimes chased off the more obvious charlatans, and rival apothecaries could turn a crowd hostile with just one pointed question about the contents of widow's comfort. But the best travelling quacks knew how to vanish at dawn, just ahead of their reputation. In one town, they were hailed as miracle workers. In the next, wanted posters might feature their lopsided smile. For the villagers, the quack's arrival was part medicine, part spectacle, and all hope. Maybe the potion would work, maybe it wouldn't. But for a night, everyone got to believe in miracles, and the world seemed a little brighter, even if it tasted faintly of graveyard and regret. You'd think eating ancient body parts might have some downsides, and you'd be right. Allergic reactions, fevers, the occasional haunting, side effects were a normal part of medieval healthcare. If you survived your medicine, you were probably cured. Let's be honest. If your doctor today prescribed you a smoothie made from ground-up mummy, a pinch of skull moss, and just a dab of candied human fat, you'd probably get a second opinion or a lawyer. But in the Middle Ages, this was just another Tuesday at the apothecary. And just like any powerful medicine, these remedies came with a grab bag of side effects that made the original illness look like a walk in the park. Start with the obvious: digestive distress. Your gut, already traumatized by medieval bread and questionable beer, now had to contend with a dose of powdered bone or congealed blood. Nausea was almost a guarantee. In fact, some doctors actually saw vomiting as a sign the medicine was working. If you turned green, fainted, or broke into a sweat, you'd be reassured that your body was expelling the bad humours. Bonus points if you survived the treatment and the disease. Allergies, too, were par for the course. If you were lucky, you just broke out in a rash after eating candied toe. If you were unlucky, the reaction was a little more dramatic. Medieval records are peppered with stories of swelling tongues, sudden fevers, and fits of madness following a hearty dose of corpse oil or mummy powder. Of course, there was no EpiPen, just prayers and maybe a cold compress, assuming the local priest didn't suggest a touch more relic dust to chase away the evil spirits. Then there were the infections. Hygiene in medieval pharmacies was, at best, a suggestion. Ingredients were sourced from muddy graveyards, blood-soaked scaffolds, and whatever the resurrection men could carry without being caught. It wasn't uncommon to pick up something extra with your dose. Bacteria, mold, worms, or whatever happened to be living in the moss on that famous skull. If your wound didn't heal, the remedy was always the same. More medicine, now with added mystery. And let's not forget the psychological effects. After all, eating something that was recently a person, or at least a memorable part of one, can do strange things to the mind. People wrote of disturbed dreams, fits of guilt, or the persistent feeling that the medicine was watching them. In a world already obsessed with ghosts and curses, it didn't take much for a side effect to become a full-blown haunting. Sure, your headache's gone, but why do you keep hearing someone whispering in Latin every time you pass the graveyard? Overdose was another hazard. In the quest for healing, more was often considered better. Apothecaries gave out impressively vague dosage instructions. A spoonful, a pinch, or until the visions stop. Take too little and nothing happened. Take too much and you might spend the night hallucinating about pharaohs, saints, or the guy whose toe you just ate. It's history's weirdest version of consult your doctor if symptoms persist. Of course, the placebo effect was alive and well. For every horror story, there were claims of miraculous cures, sudden bursts of strength, or a rash vanishing overnight. Was it the medicine? Was it coincidence? Or did fear just shock your immune system into working overtime? Medieval folks weren't picky. If you woke up feeling better and still among the living, you chalked it up as a win and shared the recipe with your neighbor, minus a few of the details. The church was torn, half horrified, half opportunistic. Officially, cannibalism was a sin. Unofficially, if the local bishop needed a little pick-me-up, well, who's to judge? Divine permission covered a multitude of sins. Let's unravel the tangled relationship between medieval medicine and the moral authorities of the age. In theory, the rules were clear. Eating human flesh, even powdered and served in a fancy reliquary, was a big theological no-no. After all, the Bible is pretty direct about cannibalism being bad news. But as with so many things in the Middle Ages, theory and practice existed in parallel universes, one built on sermons, the other on very practical problem-solving. If eating a sliver of Saint's finger cured Lord Geoffrey's persistent boils, then who were the local clergy to stand in the way of God's mysterious ways? Church doctrine, of course, was a matter of public record. Canon law condemned the eating of human remains. Except, of course, in the most exceptional cases, like if the body part was already a recognized relic, or if you were really desperate and promised to pray extra hard on Sunday. This left a loophole wide enough to drive an ox cart through, especially for those with money, influence, or a particularly persuasive priest on the payroll. Many clergy turned a blind eye to the more questionable uses of body parts, especially if the practice brought in donations or helped fill the church's coffers. Relics were big business. Pilgrims came from miles around to see, and sometimes discreetly taste, the bone of Street Felix, or the miracle blood of Street Agnes, each promising a cure for anything from lameness to heartbreak. Officially, this was all about reverence and faith. Unofficially, there was a thriving trade in spiritual medicine, with certain monks developing a real knack for relic distribution, and a very loose definition of authentic. Meanwhile, the state had its own interests. Kings and noble patrons loved a good public miracle, and corpse medicine was a perfect blend of spectacle, hope, and plausible deniability. If a ruler recovered from illness after sipping a vial of blessed marrow, it proved divine favor, cemented his rule, and conveniently distracted everyone from the latest tax hike or military disaster. When powerful families wanted the choicest relics or the best, skull moss, church and state could work together in surprisingly efficient ways, greasing palms, forging letters of authenticity, and organizing processions that doubled as advertisements for local apothecaries. And when things went wrong, when side effects kicked in, or a relic proved less miraculous than promised, everyone involved had a well-practiced routine. The church could issue a stern warning about false relics, blame an unscrupulous merchant, or simply remind everyone that true healing comes from faith, not fungus. The state, for its part, might tighten up graveyard security or launch a very public investigation that somehow never led to any high-status arrests. In the meantime, the everyday business of relics, corpse medicine, and moral gymnastics marched on. Of course, not everyone in the church was comfortable with these blurred lines. The occasional fiery preacher would rail against the sin of devouring the dead, and a handful of scholars argued for stricter boundaries. But in a world with few real cures, hope was as good as gold. And if it meant bending the rules, most people were willing to look the other way. Even the most pious bishop knew that a well-timed miracle could draw a crowd, and a little holy powder could tip the scales between sickness and survival, or at least fill the collection plate. So, if you ever wonder how medieval Europe managed to balance the moral high ground with a thriving trade in bones, blood, and blessed ointments, just remember, faith can move mountains, or at least make a loophole wide enough for everyone to squeeze through. In the end, the church and state both managed to stay just clean enough to keep their power, while still dirty enough to keep hope and business alive. As demand outstripped supply, a bustling black market grew. Want a piece of genuine saint, or just a discounted femur? All you needed was coin and the willingness to never ask follow-up questions. Step into any bustling medieval city after dark, and you'd find a thriving underbelly that made the official markets look downright boring. If the town square was for bread and cabbages, the back alleys were for more exclusive fare. Psst, looking for a relic. I've got knuckle bones, 2 whole toe joints, and a suspiciously fresh rib. No questions, no receipts. It was the eBay of the pre-internet world, except instead of buyer protection, your only guarantee was a wink and a prayer. It wasn't just desperate peasants trading pocket change for hope. Nobles, clergy, and even well-respected physicians all dipped a toe, sometimes literally, into the black market. Official relics, supposedly authenticated by the church, were rare and expensive, reserved for high altars or big city cathedrals. But the demand for saintly bones and healing fragments far outstripped the legal supply. Enter the entrepreneurial grave robber, the middleman who could get you anything from a chunk of street. Agnes's collarbone to the leftover skull moss from last Thursday's execution. It was a true buyer's market. If you had the cash, you could shop around for just the right miracle. Relics came in all sizes and levels of authenticity, from guaranteed genuine to probably not a horse bone. Want something to cure your migraines? There was a special price for items that had a good backstory, preferably a martyr. The more dramatic, the better. Need a cure for your son's mysterious rash? Maybe a chipped kneecap from a recently canonized bishop. Still humming with holiness, bargain hunters could opt for the grab bag. One saint, assorted fragments, all sales final. The sellers themselves were a colourful bunch. Grave robbers worked in teams, slipping into churchyards by night, careful to avoid patrols and nosy neighbours. They knew which tombs were easy, which were guarded, and which belonged to unpopular saints. Less demand, more supply. Some even offered personal shopping, bring a list, and they'd deliver the goods, usually with a healthy side of plausible deniability. For the truly ambitious, forgery was a thriving sideline. With a little wax, paint, and creative storytelling, almost any bone could become a holy relic if you squinted and prayed hard enough. No one talked too loudly about where the bones came from, of course. The less reputable apothecaries stocked their shelves with whatever the night shift delivered, while church officials, when they needed to look the other way, simply issued new rules on what qualified as a relic. Was it really cannibalism if you bought the toe at a fair price? Was it even a sin if you couldn't trace the saint's family tree? In medieval logic, if it worked, it was holy. If it didn't, well, you just bought a piece of local history. The risks were high. If caught, grave robbers could expect heavy fines, public humiliation, or even a turn at the gallows themselves. Some took precautions, forming networks with secret handshakes and coded language. A candle left burning in a certain window meant fresh goods that night. A certain pattern of knocks on a cellar door meant your order was ready. Bring your own sack, please. And maybe a flask of wine to grease the deal. Customers, for their part, quickly learned to keep their purchases quiet. No one wanted to answer awkward questions about the new family relic, especially when Uncle Walter's grave was looking a bit disturbed. Still, the lure of miracle cures and holy protection was too powerful to resist. Word spread quickly when a new shipment came in, and buyers lined up, coins clinking, ready to buy a little piece of eternity, or at least a temporary reprieve from their aches and fears. Before chemistry, medicine was part magic, part blind optimism. If eating a dried kidney didn't help your gout, maybe it balanced your humors. Or maybe you just needed a stronger stomach. The truth is, medieval science was a chaotic buffet of ideas, equal parts wishful thinking and creative desperation. Doctors didn't have microscopes or germ theory. What they did have was a stack of ancient books, a lot of creative explanations, and a culture that mixed philosophy, superstition, and a dash of kitchen sink experimentalism. The heart of all this was the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If you felt sick, it wasn't because of a virus or bacteria. It was because your humours were out of whack, like a soup recipe gone wrong. This approach led to some wild prescriptions. If you were too sad, an excess of black bile, maybe a nice uplifting treat of dried heart, cooked with herbs, could fix your mood. Too fiery, excess yellow bile, cool things down with a little powder of bone, or perhaps a draught of blood, best served fresh. It didn't matter that the logic was basically fight fire with whatever you can find in a tomb. As long as the treatment didn't kill you on the spot, it went down as a success. Spirits, too, played a huge role. Not the liquid kind, although those made frequent appearances in the apothecary's back room, but invisible forces that drifted through daily life. If you got better after nibbling a saint's toenail, people said you'd absorbed some of their spirit. A magical handoff of virtue, luck, or stubbornness. Healing was a team effort. A little bit of prayer, a little bit of relic, and a lot of hoping no one noticed you'd actually just eaten an old bone. If all else failed, magic filled the gaps. Amulets, prayers, and ritual powders were just as common as dried herbs and bloodletting. Every self-respecting apothecary kept a book of spells tucked under the counter, right next to the recipe for syrup of fat. Cures were tested by reciting prayers or checking the phase of the moon. And if your luck was bad, you could always blame it on a passing witch or an unfriendly neighbor with a suspicious mole. Modern medicine might demand double-blind studies, but in medieval times, a miraculous recovery was proof enough for everyone involved. And then there was the placebo effect, working overtime before anyone even had a word for it. If the village elder said that boiled knuckle bones would fix your cough, most people started to feel better before the pot had finished simmering. The expectation of healing was sometimes more powerful than anything scraped off a skull or pinched from a saint's shrine. If someone miraculously survived the pox after a dose of corpse oil, neighbors would line up the next morning, ready for their turn. Never mind that the same medicine failed the last 5 patients. There was, of course, an art to medieval optimism. If one cure didn't work, you simply moved on to the next, or doubled the dose. If you survived, it was a sign the medicine was good. If not, well, it was God's will, or the devil's trick, or maybe you just didn't eat enough blessed moss. Failure was rarely the doctor's fault. Instead, it was blamed on fate, bad timing, or a lack of faith, preferably yours. So, in a world where science was mostly guesswork, and every cure was a shot in the dark, medicine was as much about hope as it was about healing. Today's miracle cure is tomorrow's horror story. But for medieval folk, every dose came with a side of optimism and a large helping of magical thinking. So the next time you try a new superfood or a wellness hack, remember, we're all still hoping for a little magic, even if our medicine tastes a lot less like dried kidney these days. It's DIY time. Medieval cookbooks, yes, really, included recipes for everything from boiled bones for melancholy to syrup of human heart. Directions: mix, stir. Try not to think about it and pray for results. Let's picture your average medieval kitchen. It's smoky, a little drafty, and filled with the gentle hum of livestock, family chatter, and the unmistakable sound of a mortar and pestle grinding up something. If you are hoping for a nice stew or a hearty loaf of bread, you're in for a surprise. Because tonight's special isn't just turnip soup, it's a batch of remedies that would make your local pharmacist faint. First, gather your ingredients. Need a boost for your blood? Track down some powdered skull, best sourced from a criminal recently removed from this world. Got a lingering sadness or melancholy? Boiled bones, gently simmered, were all the rage. Just strain out the bits and drink the broth with a blessing. For heartache, literal or emotional, nothing beats a spoonful of syrup of human heart. Chopped, simmered with honey and herbs, and served lukewarm. If your medieval friends had a family recipe book, it probably included sections for both dinner and unorthodox cures, sometimes on the same page. The prep was half the adventure. Some remedies required drying ingredients in the sun. Do not let the neighbor's chickens peck the saint's toe. Others called for slow roasting, turned frequently to prevent burning the humors, and some demanded a midnight harvest, preferably on a full moon. If it all sounds a bit witchy, that's because home healing was a blend of folk magic, rumor, and a stubborn willingness to experiment. Instructions rarely got more specific than just enough to fill a small jar, a pinch, or whatever you can stomach, and until the patient stops screaming. Mixing was its own skill. A true medieval DIYer prided themselves on creative combinations. Grind dried liver with rose petals for strength, blend gallows moss with goat's milk for peaceful sleep, and, if you were feeling particularly fancy, candy a slice of fat for your next arthritic flare-up. Syrups and tonics could be sweetened with honey or spiced wine, because nothing says healing like hiding the flavor of regret under a layer of sugar and cloves. Presentation mattered, too. Many recipes advised serving remedies in a fine cup or on a fresh cloth, the better to impress both the patient and the neighbors. Some families even had dedicated remedy spoons for such occasions, washed occasionally, but mostly just blessed and reused. Passing down a recipe for bone broth supreme became a rite of passage, with tips like never use a left-handed thief's femur and always stir clockwise to avoid inviting trouble. And what if you didn't have access to the freshest corpse? Resourceful medieval cooks got creative. A little animal bone in place of human, a touch of pig's blood for colour, or even a handful of garden moss when the local gallows was running behind schedule. It was the original farm to table, only with a lot more plausible deniability. Of course, results were mixed. Some patients swore by their grandmother's skull tea. Others just swore. Sometimes you got better. Sometimes you learned to never ask what was in your cup. Occasionally, you gained a lifelong aversion to stew, but in an age without antibiotics or cold medicine, a little DIY hope was better than nothing at all. Even the best authors got in on the action. Pliny the Elder wrote about corpse medicine, and Shakespeare tossed in a reference or two. It's nice to know everyone was equally confused. Let's start in ancient Rome, where Pliny the Elder Think of him as the original Wikipedia. If Wikipedia came with a lot more wine and far less fact-checking, compiled a massive encyclopedia of natural history. Pliny catalogued everything, from why you shouldn't trust an owl to the health benefits of drinking gladiator blood for epilepsy. According to Pliny, the Romans had no problem treating illness with all manner of body bits. Need a pick-me-up? Try a little powder from a dead man's tooth, or rub a soldier's sweat on your wounds. His writings became a treasure trove for medieval doctors centuries later, who found in them endless justification for a pinch of powdered hero in your soup. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, these old Roman recommendations had achieved almost biblical authority. If Pliny wrote it, you could be sure your local apothecary would try to sell it. Sometimes, literally, as a medicinal nose. The nose, believe it or not, had a starring role. Some doctors swore by the health-giving power of snuffing a dried, ground nose, or applying it as a salve to one's own nose. Why? The logic was pure medieval gold. Like cures like, and maybe a dash of morbid curiosity. The confusion didn't stop with science writers. Shakespeare, never one to miss a weird detail, occasionally peppered his plays with references to the more colourful corners of medicine. In Othello, he nods to the use of mummy, that is, Egyptian mummy powder, as an ingredient in love potions and poisons. The idea that the greatest playwright in English history might have had a laugh about corpse medicine is oddly comforting. Clearly, even geniuses found the era's remedies both strange and hilarious. Literary figures across Europe weighed in, sometimes mocking, sometimes marvelling, and often sounding just as bewildered as modern readers. Medical treatises, poems, and plays debated the best way to prepare your hero's marrow, or whether relics and saintly bits worked better if they were sung to by monks. One particularly memorable story came from a 16th century French writer who claimed a man cured his fever by wearing a mummified nose around his neck, so the spirits may enter through the nostrils, as God intended. No word on whether the fever left, but his friends definitely did. Books also gave patients and doctors plausible deniability. If someone raised an eyebrow at your bone broth or questioned why your cough syrup smelled like a burial site, you could always quote Pliny or point to a famous playwright. If it's good enough for Shakespeare, it's good enough for me, was the medieval version of I read it online. Even the church sometimes got in on the act, publishing sermons that borrowed heavily from medical literature, sometimes mixing scripture with questionable science. It was all a blur of authority and tradition, perfect for an age when nobody wanted to admit they were just guessing. Of course, there were skeptics too. Some writers and poets had a field day mocking the whole business. Satirical pamphlets made the rounds, poking fun at the lengths people would go to chase a miracle cure. One popular story involved a quack apothecary who ran out of relics and substituted turnip slices. No one noticed, but everyone felt better, proving that sometimes belief is the best medicine. In the end, the world's greatest writers didn't clarify corpse medicine. They just helped everyone laugh, wince, or wonder. So if you're ever baffled by a wellness fad or some influencer's questionable smoothie recipe, remember, confusion, skepticism, and a healthy dose of humor are as old as medicine itself. And if Shakespeare, Pliny, and a parade of medieval poets couldn't make sense of it, you don't have to, either. From kings who overdosed on mummy powder to nobles who died chasing immortality, history is full of cautionary tales. Nothing says oops like a sudden epidemic of haunted headaches. Let's be real. For every medieval story about a miraculous cure, there's a matching disaster lurking in the footnotes. As tempting as corpse medicine sounded to desperate patients, and as persuasive as the apothecary's sales pitch could be, the reality was that things often went very, very wrong. If you ever wondered why today's medicine comes with a pamphlet of side effects, thank the centuries of trial, error, and sheer horror that came before it. Take the case of King Francis I of France, who suffered from recurring migraines and was a firm believer in the power of Egyptian mummy powder. His doctors dutifully scraped, stirred, and served him doses fit for a pharaoh, all the while assuring him that he'd be right as rain by the next joust. The result? More headaches, and a slew of mysterious stomach ailments that even the palace cat refused to investigate. The cure wasn't just worse than the disease, it probably caused a few new ones. Then there's the saga of the Habsburgs. A family tree so complicated it was practically a hedge maze, with enough weird medical stories to fill their own haunted castle. Obsessed with the promise of long life and boundless energy, Habsburg nobles chugged elixirs brewed from blood, bone, and whatever relic happened to be lying around after a particularly festive execution. Some reportedly suffered fits, fever, and in one memorable case, hallucinations so intense that a nobleman tried to duel his own reflection. Historians still debate whether it was the mummy powder or just the family genetics. Of course, you didn't have to be royal to end up in a corpse medicine catastrophe. Records are littered with tales of ambitious apothecaries whose miracle cures sparked neighborhood epidemics. One town in 17th century Germany experienced a surge in sudden fright and night terrors after a local doctor whipped up a batch of syrup containing powdered skull and moldy bread. Instead of curing fevers, the remedy led to weeks of nightmares, sleeplessness, and a new superstition about the dangers of mossy medicine. Even the elite weren't safe from the risks. In Renaissance England, mummy powder was all the rage among fashionable Londoners, when a shipment of the prized powder turned out to be mostly local graveyard sweepings and animal bones. A rash of unexplained illnesses swept through the city's upper crust. Sufferers complained of violent stomach cramps, voices in the walls, and a lasting aversion to both mummies and their local pharmacist. And then there were the self-experimenters, those enthusiastic nobles and scholars who believed if one pinch of powdered hero was good, a heaping spoonful would be better. In many cases, these homebrew cures resulted in allergic reactions, fevers, and occasionally untimely death. The most infamous case? A minor nobleman who believed ingesting the dried heart of a valiant knight would transfer bravery. All it transferred was a spectacular bout of food poisoning and a cautionary poem recited for decades at every family gathering. All these failures didn't go unnoticed. Over time, as bodies stacked up and miracle cures fell short, skeptics began to speak a little louder. Some doctors started quietly backing away from corpse-based prescriptions, and even royal courts grew tired of remedies that turned out to be more curse than cure. Eventually, people started to notice that corpse medicine was mostly weird and almost never worked. The Enlightenment brought new ideas, scientific method, and the groundbreaking discovery that medicine shouldn't be haunted. It turns out that even the bravest patient, or most creative apothecary, has their limits. After a few too many haunted headaches, questionable stomach cramps, and, let's face it, the embarrassment of explaining your bone syrup habit to your grandkids, Europe began to lose its appetite for corpse-based remedies. It wasn't so much a moral awakening as a collective sigh of maybe we shouldn't be eating the neighbors. Enter the Enlightenment, a period when people got serious about thinking for themselves, doubting authority, and generally asking, why are we drinking ground-up mummies again? Suddenly, it wasn't enough for a medicine to have a dramatic backstory or a bishop's blessing. It had to do something, preferably without side effects, that sounded like a ghost story. The best and brightest minds started looking for answers in the lab, not the crypt. Scientific method arrived on the scene with the energy of a fed-up parent cleaning out the world's weirdest pantry. Doctors and scientists started observing, recording, and experimenting. Instead of mixing powdered hero with honey and hoping for the best, they tested, measured, and, shockingly, sometimes admitted when things didn't work. When patients recovered after rest and a good meal, but not after a dose of candied fat, a few brave souls put two and two together. Maybe it was the nap, and not the necromancy. Outrage followed. Religious reformers and rationalist philosophers teamed up. Never a great sign for apothecaries who'd invested heavily in mummy powder. Outspoken critics condemned corpse medicine as superstitious, unchristian, and, worst of all, embarrassingly unscientific. The rise of newspapers and pamphlets meant that the failures of bone broth and king's drops spread faster than ever, complete with woodcut illustrations of horrified doctors and unfortunate patients. Actual doctors, meaning those who washed their hands occasionally and owned at least one microscope, became the new authorities. They scoffed at blood tonics and skull moss, and instead championed clean water, fresh air, and, when possible, not eating anything you'd find in a crypt. Medical schools sprang up across Europe, teaching anatomy, chemistry, and botany instead of how to bribe an executioner for extra moss. Textbooks replaced recipe books, and the most prestigious physicians were those who could identify a fever without reaching for a jar of candied tow. Gradually, the markets for corpse medicine dried up. Apothecaries quietly pushed their stocks to the back of the shelf, hoping no one would notice the jars labeled best before, the Black Death. Families who once bragged about their genuine saintly finger for fevers now exchange stories about the wonders of laudanum or the modern marvel of bed rest. Royal courts discovered the joys of mineral water and imported lemons. Even the black market, ever adaptable, shifted its focus to more fashionable contraband, like coffee, chocolate, or pamphlets about the dangers of eating bones. Of course, a few diehards held on, convinced that science was just a passing fad, and nothing beat a good haunted syrup for what ailed you. But by the 1800s, corpse medicine had become the punchline to a very long, very uncomfortable joke. Before you get smug, remember, humans are still eating questionable supplements, rhino horn, and miracle powders. The next time you pop a vitamin, just be glad it isn't labeled Mummy Light. Let's be honest. Our modern health and wellness aisles are still just one wild marketing campaign away from the medieval apothecary. Sure, you're probably not dusting your cereal with powdered Pharaoh. But if you take a look at today's hottest trends, the line between science and superstition is sometimes a little blurrier than we'd like to admit. Is that ancient herb really a miracle cure, or just rebranded hay fever in a capsule? We humans haven't lost our appetite for the strange, the rare, or the hope in a bottle. Walk into any health store and you'll see shelves groaning under the weight of exotic supplements, sea moss, deer antler, shark cartilage, bee venom, and whatever else some influencer declared a must-have last Tuesday. Some people still swear by the restorative powers of powdered animal parts. In fact, the global market for things like powdered rhino horn or bear bile has never really disappeared. It's just gone a bit more underground and is now mostly illegal. And what about miracle powders? Protein, collagen, greens, and detox dusts come with claims that would have made any medieval quack proud. Rebuild your youth, support immune balance, channel your inner warrior. Swap the labels and the claims haven't changed much in 700 years. Only now the packaging is shinier and the taste is slightly less haunted. Consider the rise of bone broth, a modern favorite that's not so different from your ancestors' favorite melancholy cure, or the obsession with activated charcoal to soak up bad vibes and toxins, a direct descendant of medieval remedies that used burnt bones to draw out the poison. There are even modern companies selling desiccated organ supplements, promising that a pill made from ground-up cow liver will do for you what the king's drops once did for nervous royals. The difference? Now, the testimonials are on TikTok, not on parchment. Of course, modern medicine is, thankfully, much more evidence-based. You're not likely to find blood tonics in the cold and flu aisle or get a prescription for candied fat. But our faith in the newest thing, the ancient secret, or the miracle ingredient is still as strong as ever. For every double-blind study, there's 1,000 anecdotal stories, glowing online reviews, or desperate forum posts hoping for a quick fix. The placebo effect hasn't gone anywhere. It just comes with a 30-day return policy. And then there's the ever-present natural is better pitch, as if eating ground-up horn or fermented fungus is automatically healthier because someone, somewhere, swore by it centuries ago. We laugh at the idea of drinking mummy powder for a headache, but some people today will pay big money for pills made from New Zealand sheep placenta or Himalayan rock dust. The modern supplement industry is a $150 billion beast, and while plenty of it is backed by science, a good chunk relies on the same wishful thinking that kept medieval corpse cures in business for centuries. So, as you reach for your multivitamin, collagen shot, or the latest Instagram-approved adaptogen, take a moment to honor the old ways, if only to recognize them in your own cart. History is a loop, and the search for wellness will always attract a little bit of magic, a lot of hope, and more than a few questionable recipes. At least now you can be pretty sure your medicine isn't haunted. In every medieval town, apothecaries competed for bragging rights over whose mummy powder had the extra crunch, or whose blood vial was fresh from the gallows this morning. Business rivalries got weirdly intense. Imagine a bake-off, but instead of cakes, it's preserved elbows, and everyone's judging mouthfeel. Welcome to the weirdly competitive, often hilarious, and always unsettling world of the medieval apothecary. These were not your friendly, white-coated pharmacists of today. In the cutthroat market of corpse medicine, apothecaries were more like culinary gladiators, each one desperate to outdo their neighbor with ever fresher, ever weirder ingredients. Window displays became showcases for the finest wares. One might have an artfully arranged skull powder, another a row of blood vials gleaming like rubies in the sunday. If you've ever watched neighbors argue over whose tomatoes are ripest, multiply that by 10 and throw in a dash of human thigh bone. Let's say you're shopping for a little something to help your chronic headaches. You step inside one shop where the apothecary, let's call him Master Jeff, proudly announces that his mummy powder comes direct from Cairo, and he even sprinkles a bit into your palm to prove its crunch. He insists this is the secret to his client's long life and extra smooth skin. Across the street, Mistress Agnes leans out her window to inform passing customers that her blood tonic is never more than 1 hour off the scaffold. The rumor is she's even bribed the executioner's apprentice to alert her before the last heartbeat has faded. It didn't take much to spark a rivalry. If one apothecary landed a particularly famous criminal's skull, you'd better believe that news would be all over town before the executioner's axe was wiped clean. "Genuine powder of notorious highwayman," read one sign. "The only tonic with actual bits of Baron von Bad Guy," declared another. Customers would debate the merits of different vintages of bone and the relative healing properties of various felonies. Apparently, thieves' bones were good for headaches, while traitors' blood worked wonders on heartache. Who knew? To keep up with the competition, apothecaries invented increasingly elaborate stories and concoctions. Some claimed their mummy powder came with a papyrus certificate, blessed by a Coptic priest. Others added gold, flakes, or exotic spices, promising added potency and a guaranteed upset stomach. Trade secrets were guarded more fiercely than the king's coin vault. Shop apprentices were sometimes sent undercover to rival stores, tasked with buying samples and sneaking them back for analysis. Taste tests and public demonstrations were staged, with dramatic results, occasional vomiting, fainting, or, if all went well, an immediate miracle cure. Judging was half the fun. Community elders might be called in to sample the latest batch of skull syrup, while local housewives compared notes on which apothecary's moss from the hanged cured their children's nightmares faster. There were even whispered allegations of sabotage, rumours that someone had swapped out Master Jeff's gallows fat for nothing but mutton tallow, or that Mistress Agnes had padded her blood supply with sheep's blood on slow execution weeks. Nothing stoked business quite like a scandal. This relentless competition did have one upside: a steady improvement in remedies, at least in creativity. If not in actual effectiveness, apothecaries became adept at stretching ingredients, blending in new flavors, and packaging their wares in ever more appealing jars. And while the average villager might have been playing a game of medical roulette, they could at least be confident they were getting the freshest, fanciest batch of corpse cure that local rivalry could provide. It's the middle of a church service, and the priest unveils a bone fragment supposedly from Street Mildred herself. Is it a holy relic, a miraculous cure, or just next week's ingredient in the town's cough syrup? In a world where faith and pharmacy overlap, nobody's quite sure whether to pray over the bone or grind it up with honey. This was the dizzyingly ambiguous world of medieval relics, a place where the sacred and the suspiciously practical existed side by side, and where even the holiest of bones might end up on the shelf at your local apothecary. The cult of relics wasn't just a religious movement, it was an entire sub-economy. Relics drew pilgrims, who brought donations and built the church's reputation. But they also attracted those with a sore throat, a bad cough, or a truly impressive case of wishful thinking. Officially, relics were objects of veneration. Bones, blood, hair, and even the odd tooth of saints, stored in ornate reliquaries and paraded through the streets on feast days. People lined up for a glimpse, a prayer, or, if they were lucky, a quick touch. The hope was that some of the saint's holiness would rub off, working wonders for everything from persistent boils to heartbreak. Monasteries kept careful ledgers tracking the miracles supposedly granted by each fragment, though, suspiciously, some bones seemed to work a lot harder during cold and flu season. But in an age where every ailment demanded a remedy, and every remedy needed a story, the line between veneration and consumption got blurry, fast. Apothecaries traded in blessed bone dust, scraped from relics with a discreet wink. Stories circulated about monks caught pilfering relic cabinets or quietly selling shavings to wealthy clients. Sometimes, after the festival crowds had gone, the healing relic would lose a few more splinters than the priest remembered. There were even debates, sometimes quite heated, about which saints produced the most potent remedies. Was Street Agnes better for headaches, while Street Hubert specialized in fevers? Was the effectiveness of a relic enhanced by its age? Or did you want something fresh? Apothecaries played up the marketing, labeling bottles with elaborate claims. St. Mildred's authentic bone powder cures coughs, lifts spirits, fends off scurvy. To the devout, these were spiritual panaceas. To the sick, they were just the best hope going. And for those who couldn't afford a full fragment, there were relics, tiny shavings, dust, or, in some less reputable shops, a pinch of anonymous bone passed off as something holy. Buyers rarely asked for proof, and sellers rarely offered it. If you got better, everyone agreed it was the saint's intervention. If you didn't, perhaps you needed to double your dose or your donation. Even the clergy weren't immune to the lure of relic medicine. Parish priests who fell ill sometimes borrowed a little extra holiness from their own collections, quietly scraping a sliver into their porridge. If the church coffers were low, a savvy abbot might find ways to spread the blessings, with small relic parcels sent to wealthy patrons in exchange for hefty tithes. The The most enterprising could supply both the faithful and the ailing, maintaining a delicate balance between devotion and business. All of this, of course, led to no small amount of skepticism and occasional scandal. Satirical writers mocked the bone trade. Rival parishes accused each other of relic fraud. And more than one miracle cure turned out to be little more than clever marketing and desperate hope. Still, in a world where disease and death were never far away, faith and pharmacy were two sides of the same coin, each offering comfort, and neither asking too many questions. Forget the Silk Road. The real trade action was in imported body parts. Merchants shipped powdered mummy from Egypt, skulls from Germany, and occasionally something labelled genuine wizard's toe from wherever wizards retired. If your medicine cabinet had more passport stamps than your actual life, congratulations. You are truly cosmopolitan. Let's take a quick journey through history's strangest import business. While silk, spices, and precious metals usually steal the spotlight in tales of global trade, the most bizarre cargoes quietly sailed the same routes. Sacks of dusty bones, bundles of preserved flesh, and crates of relics that could get you blessed, cured, or just spectacularly sick. The international corpse trade was booming, and the more exotic, the better. Egypt, of course, was the celebrity supplier. Demand for mumia, genuine Egyptian mummy powder, was so high that traders combed the Nile's banks for new burial sites, ready to haggle with tomb robbers for the best, read least sandy, stock. Apothecaries in Paris and London advertised fresh shipments with as much fanfare as a royal procession. Never mind that many of the goods were second-hand at best, and, after centuries underground, only slightly more medicinal than the sand they came packed in. Authenticity was mostly a matter of who told the best story. But Egypt wasn't the only region cashing in. German graveyards became famous for providing top-quality skulls and bones, particularly for medicinal powders and so-called skull moss. Executioners, who managed the local supply chain, had brisk business dealings with merchants traveling from all over Europe. They wrapped the goods in linen, scribbled on a label from a notorious highwayman, excellent for headaches, and sent them on their way to bustling city apothecaries. And then there were the specialty items, the kind of rare, high-status remedies that only the wealthiest could afford. In Venice, you might be offered the finger bone of a Moorish prince. In Florence, a bottle labelled elixir of wizard's toe, which may or may not have been clipped off a goat, sat proudly in the display case. If it sounded impressive and came from far away, it was worth double. Merchants became master storytellers, their tall tales as valuable as the contents of their sacks. Every port city in Europe had its own cast of characters. Customs officials willing to look the other way for the right price. Monks with a taste for international relics, and dock workers who knew that the box-marked dried figs might just rattle suspiciously when shaken. At the big markets, foreign goods were displayed alongside barrels of wine and stacks of spices, with buyers encouraged to sniff, taste, and test, just not too closely. All of this cross-border commerce created a thriving black market. Smugglers operated shadow routes, sneaking forbidden relics past local authorities and church watchdogs. Counterfeiters, meanwhile, added another layer of chaos. German bones repackaged as genuine pharaoh, scraps of leather passed off as holy flesh, and anything else that could be ground, wrapped, and blessed for sale. The only guarantee was that your medicine cabinet was getting more international than your local cathedral. These global networks didn't just move merchandise, they moved ideas. Recipes and remedies crossed borders, blending German superstition with Egyptian tradition, Venetian marketing with Parisian flair. New fads swept across Europe. One year, everyone was obsessed with Spanish relic oil. The next, all the rage was for Scandinavian gallows moss. For patients, This meant a constantly changing menu of options, each more exotic, expensive, and questionably effective than the last. Of course, the greatest beneficiaries were the merchants themselves, who profited handsomely and risked little beyond the occasional run-in with a customs official or an irate priest. For everyone else, it was a matter of faith, hope, and, just occasionally, a real medical result. More often than not, swallowing a pinch of imported miracle did nothing more than lighten your purse and boost your dinner party cred. If the king chugged a chalice of ground-up skull with his morning porridge, everyone else wanted a sip. Corpse medicine went from desperate remedy to high fashion as nobles boasted about their personal supply of bespoke bone meal, because nothing says status like a liver lozenge from the crowned heads of Europe. In the weird world of medieval medicine, fashion wasn't just about silk or the latest codpiece. It was about what, or rather who, you had in your medicine cabinet. And as with all things extravagant, it was the royals and nobility who set the tone. A king's breakfast table might look less like a banquet and more like the back room of a very well-connected apothecary. If the monarch swore by a daily dose of powdered hero or candied heart, courtiers and aspiring social climbers rushed to do the same, often in ever more elaborate and ostentatious ways. It started with the royal physicians, always eager to please. When the king suffered from a headache, they brought out their most exotic remedies. Mummy powder straight from Egypt, or so they claimed, skull moss imported from the finest German gallows, and elixirs distilled from bones, with pedigrees longer than most royal family trees. To be granted a vial from the king's own stash was a mark of favour. To copy the royal regimen, a public demonstration of both loyalty and wealth. Before long, nobles were sending their agents on missions across Europe to secure the freshest, rarest, and most headline-grabbing corpse remedies. Dinner parties featured friendly competition over who had the best vintage mummy powder, the most notorious criminal's marrow, or the spiciest tale of relic acquisition. Ah, yes, my headache disappeared after just a taste of Archbishop Walther's toe. Simply divine. You really must try it. Of course, this was about more than health. Corpse medicine became a luxury good, a symbol of status that showed you had the resources to buy something both powerful and forbidden. It was the medieval equivalent of driving a gold-plated carriage or owning a pet leopard. Rumours spread of nobles hoarding entire collections of medicinal bones and keeping private crypts stocked for special occasions. Personal apothecaries guarded these troves like dragons, with inventories that read more like ghost stories than medical charts. As for the actual consumption, the recipes grew as fancy as the palaces themselves. Candied human fat was blended with saffron and rosewater. Elixirs were perfumed with rare spices and gold leaf. Skulls were ground with pearls and amber, turning cure into a display piece fit for a feast. Even the process of taking medicine became a performance. Nobles would sip their restorative potions with a flourish, swapping knowing glances and stories about the provenance of their ingredients. One-upmanship was half the fun. Like all trends, cannibal chic trickled down. Ambitious merchants and middling nobles copied the royal fashions as best they could, sometimes with hilarious results. When authentic pharaoh dust was out of reach, any old bone would do, preferably with a creative backstory and a bit of aromatic resin to mask the truth. Apothecaries scrambled to meet demand, inventing ever wilder tales and blends, while the church frowned, shrugged, and occasionally asked for a sample for study purposes only. So, here we are at the end of another journey, through the dim, drafty, and undeniably bizarre corners of history. This time, sifting through the powdered skulls, mummy jars, and medicinal oddities that passed for healthcare when Wi-Fi, antibiotics, and basic decency were still centuries away. Tonight, as you lie in your soft, thoroughly human-free bed, maybe take a second to appreciate just how far we've come. No one is grinding up mummies for your migraines. Your doctor doesn't hand you a to-go cup of blood after your checkup. The closest you've come to corpse medicine is that multivitamin you bought at 2 a.m. because the bottle had a picture of a mountain on it. But here's the secret. Through all the questionable cures, the desperate experiments, and the high-stakes body part bargaining, medieval people weren't monsters. They were stubborn, hopeful, and sometimes just incredibly, weirdly practical. They wanted to live. They wanted to heal. And if that meant nibbling on a candied big toe with their evening prayers, so be it. There's something oddly comforting about their resilience and their willingness to try absolutely anything to feel better, no matter how bizarre it seems to us now. Maybe it's not so different from the home remedies and internet hacks people whisper about today. Maybe, deep down, we're all just searching for that one magic cure, hoping the next bottle, the next idea, the next day will finally bring us a little relief. So tonight, as you tuck yourself in, no mummy powder required, maybe whisper a small thank you to the ancestors who endured, experimented, and survived so that you could drift off to sleep with indoor plumbing, working medicine, and a minimum daily requirement of 0 haunted moss. History is messy. It's occasionally horrifying, often hilarious, but always proof that people are stubborn, creative, and a little bit ridiculous. May you have the sweetest, most peaceful dreams, and may your sleep tonight be completely, absolutely corpse-free. Good night.